才叫做鸡尾酒？你何必一定要追究？人生难得几回醉，只有一醉能笑我苦痛。这一杯酒是鸡尾酒，你举起杯来喝一口。人生难得几回醉，纵然事到如今醉也休。喝一杯鸡尾酒，喝一杯鸡尾酒。喝一杯鸡尾酒。富人家有的是高楼，你醉了你就不要走。人生难得几回醉，还是喝上一杯鸡尾酒。富人家有的是高楼，你醉了你就不要走。人生难得几回醉，还是喝上一杯鸡尾酒。富人家有的是高楼，你醉了你就不要走。人生难得几回醉，还是喝上一杯鸡尾酒。
假惺惺，假惺惺，做人何必假惺惺？你想看，你要看，你就仔细地看看清，不要那么样的装着，不要那么样的装着，一本正经，一本正经，何必假正经，假正经？你的眼睛早已经溜过来又溜过去，再偷偷地看个不停。 情难为情，什么叫做难为情？想爱我，要爱我，你就痛快地表表明，不要那么样的攀亲，不要那么样的攀亲，面孔贴近，吓坏了人，何必呢？着脸，跳着心，你的灵魂早已经飘过来又飘过去，再飘飘呀飘个不停，再飘飘呀飘个不停。
这一桩奇异的爱情，像诗歌一样的温馨，像梦儿一样的缥缈，一曲起舞踪影。这一桩奇异的爱情，像月儿一样的光明，像星儿一样的亮闪，甜蜜起舞踪影。我愿诗中的美景，我愿梦里的爱情，我愿心儿点光明，永远不断的长存。这一桩奇异的爱情，像月儿一样的光明，像星儿一样的亮闪，甜蜜起舞踪影。奇异的爱情，奇异的爱情，这奇异的爱情。诗中的美景，我愿梦里的爱情，我愿心儿点光明，永远不断的长存。这一桩奇异的爱情，像月儿一样的光明，像星儿一样的亮闪，甜蜜起舞踪影。 奇的爱情，奇的爱情，这奇奇的爱情。
So, without further ado, I'll introduce the developers. So first up, we have Jos Devite.
Good afternoon.
Do you want to tell us a little bit what you work on and things? Just to refresh everyone's memory, because I'm sure everyone watched it last time as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, I worked a lot on Central America and South America, and I'm currently working on Yunnan and Spain.
Okay. We're also joined by Flame Fang.
Hello. A good number of you should be familiar with me from having announced this, but I'm a Kaiser dev, so sort of toward the top of our leadership structure, and I've worked on China, Japan, and kind of dabbled here and there in some other places, but really the China rework is my baby.
Okay. I'll introduce myself. I'm the narrator Ben. I've done a few videos in the past for Kaiserreich, specifically Union of Britain, Austria-Hungary, and I believe another one. I can't remember off the top of my head though. And now I'm hosting these Kaiserreich Q&As. I'm not a QA. I'm not a Kaiserreich developer though, so don't ask me questions about that kind of stuff. But we're also joined by Paul. If Paul's here, is Paul here?
Hello.
Hello, Paul. Do you want to just introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm the only contributor joining you this time, so I'm sort of at the bottom of the food chain within the team. And I've worked a bit in Africa, particularly on Zambia. I'm working in the China rework right now on the legation cities. And I'm responsible in large part for some of the upcoming content for the Union of Britain as well. As you can probably tell, I am British, so...
Represent.
Oh, yeah.
And finally, we're joined by Vidya.
Hello,
Hello,
I'm the guy behind Austria-Hungary rework, and I'm also working in southern China. I also did Venezuela.
Okay, good stuff. I'm hoping that you're not all actually working in these countries. That you're just working on it within Kaiserreich.
Yeah, within KR, of course.
That'd get quite expensive. But go on, Paul.
I'm not sure how I'd work in the legation cities at this present moment, so...
But without further ado, I think it's probably best if we go straight into the questions. So we have a small number of different categories and things, and we'll be bouncing around here and there, but it should be relatively easy to follow for the viewers. So the first question we have is from the Byzantine Ball, and the question is about East Asia, and it's what exactly is the Vermillion Society in the legation cities?
So this is a question that's kind of been around. People have asked this a lot. And for good reason, because it's one of the relatively few things in the China rework and perhaps in Kaiserreich in general that isn't sort of directly descended from something historical. It's kind of a semi-original organization. That doesn't mean to say that it has no basis. It absolutely has a basis in real history. It's not something that you can sort of look for before the point of divergence and say, aha, here it is. It's something that we've kind of amalgamated from various other. So essentially, its backstory is that different revolutionary movements in China were really originally backed by a whole different series of what you might call urban intelligentsia, or a sort of literati, or however you want to put that, basically intellectuals.
Yeah.
And then with the Northern Expedition collapsing, a lot of those intellectuals that had previously backed the KMT or had been somewhat, in favor of democracy or republicanism, are faced with a China that's essentially monarchist, at least in name. So we were kind of left wondering what happens to these people. And originally they were kind of in the old AOG, so the big kind of mass in southern China, and they would lead a kind of revolution. But usually those types of figures aren't really capable of leading a revolution. I mean, we saw that in China a couple times. They kind of need a military component. So what I ended up doing with them is making them into almost like a pressure and influence group in the legation cities. A little bit of a clandestine kind of group as well that pushes pro-Republican, more liberal kind of interests, really. They support the KMT kind of a little half-heartedly, because after at the end of the day, Wang Jingwei is kind of a little bit syndicalist, right? He's pretty far left, and a lot of these figures are more conservative than he is, and a lot of them have a fair amount of money. They're more in favor of other people, like maybe Chen Zhongming down in the south, maybe Sun Qingling in the KMT, another. So their exact role is something maybe Paul could tell you more about, because he's actually working on legation cities himself.
Paul, do you want to add anything there?
Okay, so my role is mostly like deciding what goes on post 36, because Flame Fang is really the guy to ask about the China law, although I am familiar with myself, and I decided a couple of things like what exactly is the status of Hong Kong within the legation cities, etc.
Yeah.
The Vermillion Society in the game is kind of working with a very broad faction of rich Chinese businessmen, which includes everyone from your Du Yuesheng figures, who are like gangsters who made their wealth illegitimately and now are like posing almost as legitimate businessmen. Because best fact I know about Du is that in real life he was the head of the Chinese Taxpayers Association. But also like men like Robert Ho Tung and his extended family. So their in-game leader, who they'll try and put in charge of the agencies, is Robert Ho Shailai, who was a National Revolutionary Army officer in real life. They're sort of working together as a big, broad coalition, just to powermonger, mainly in Shanghai, but also in a bit in Hong Kong and Tianjin and the smaller cities. They're in the game. They're represented through the Social Liberal Party. They're a little broader than that ideologically, but they'll align with, as Flame Fang says, like Sun Qingling or Chen Zhongming, or anyone who's sympathetic to their kind of ideological leanings in China. And their ultimate goal essentially is to turn the legation cities over to them, partly for personal reasons, so they can become influential in any sort of if you like, post-upheaval Chinese Republican order, but also on an ideological basis, they are nationalists. They regard the territory is in question as like essential parts of China that have been sort of lopped off by the West.
Yeah.
So they are anti-imperialist to it.
Yeah. I mean, that was an ongoing issue for China anyway throughout that period.
Oh yeah, it's a huge point of pride, I would say, for the Chinese. In question is the fact that they've been essentially forced out of cities that are in their own country.
Yeah.
So it's whoever manages as well to persuade the if the Vermillion Society are successful in their goals, whoever they manages to sort of persuade them to come around, so to speak, is in for a major coup in terms of their legitimacy within China.
Okay. Flame, you have anything else to add to that?
Nothing that we won't discuss later in PRs.
Okay, yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. This is from Ragob12. This question's about Brazil. Basically, why are the leftist movements in Brazil much stronger in Kaiserreich than in our timeline? Over to you, guys.
I think the question was actually the opposite. Why are there not as in our time? Basically, the guy asked a different thing. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Basically, the answer to that is very broad and very wide. So I'm gonna try to sum it up into very few sentences. And that's that Brazilian socialist movements are as strong, if not weaker, than in our timeline due to the socio-economical conditions of Brazil not changing because Germany wins World War I. Basically, Brazil is still mostly agrarian with some industry in the main city, mainly in Sao Paulo and Rio, not everywhere. This means that only intellectual groups and industrial workers in the large population centers adhere to leftist ideology.
Yeah.
And while the French Revolution, the second French Revolution, like the thing where the syndicalists take over France, while that has caused quite a stir between the left-wing movements in Brazil, when in our timeline they were mostly communist, this hardly means they're more united, and in fact it means the opposite, because there's more difference between the different ideological groups in Brazil. So there's hardly anything uniting them other than maybe a crisis that can happen in the case of, well, how it happens in game, where the military takes over a left-wing government and they basically unite to kick it out with help from the liberal elements of the army.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's it for that question.
That basically sums it up.
Yeah.
Okay, so I suppose we'll carry on then. The next question's from Sava61. This is a question about Austria-Hungary. What were the many actions, policies the government did in order to keep the union between the five countries, and how were they effective? For you, Vidya.
All right. This is a pretty big question because, of course, Austria-Hungary fell in our timeline and all that stuff. And to a lot of people, this is weird or unrealistic. Well, we got to keep in mind that, first of all, the fact that the United States does not enter the First World War and there's no Wilsonian diplomacy is a huge deal. This was the thing that put the final nail in the coffin of Austria-Hungary. This does not happen. So the short answer for that is that the Viennese government compromised with the political leadership of Bohemia, Galicia, and the Croats in Croatia. And the long answer is that the radical nationalist independence movements were fairly weak in our timeline until 1917-ish. And basically, when the war ends, they return to the pre-war idea that they should strive for autonomy within the empire. And the emperor, who is pro-reform, gives into that to those demands of political autonomy. And this fails in Hungary because there's a very big basically the aristocracy of Hungary is very powerful and is not really willing to give up their privileges that they get from the Austro-Hungarian imperial system.
Yeah.
So what happens in the end towards the mid-20s is that the Austrian half democratizes essentially. And this is what keeps it going until 1936, basically, is because the autonomists are satisfied, basically.
Yeah.
And currently, you don't really see it in Hungary in the current version of the game, but the fact that it failed in Hungary will have huge consequences to the Hungarian government.
Yeah, because Austria is basically losing its control over the rest of the empire. It's basically the second dying man of Europe at this point. and it's struggling to modernize. And with Hungary being such an integral part of Austria-Hungary, it's only a matter of time.
Sort of. The sick man theory is a bit exaggerated in historiography and just like the common knowledge of the empire.
Mhm.
It was not as bad as people say, but there were obviously issues. Like that's a given.
Yeah.
And because of the reforms kind of breaking down towards the mid to late 20s, again, that's why you have the setup in 1936 of this divided empire that looks like on the not really brink of collapse, but it very well could within a couple of years.
Okay. So would you say in our I'm just going to hook that. So would you say in our timeline it wasn't a case that the result of World War One was the nail in the coffin for the Austria-Hungary Empire? Do you think it would have been able to continue on afterwards?
Without the war, absolutely. With the war, it's much more difficult, especially with how long the war goes on. But because Russia falls in 1917 and eventually the Italians are defeated in KR, then that's what basically saves it, and barely, of course.
Yeah.
But because the empire doesn't fall and because German hegemony is settled after World War One, the idea of independent nation states throughout Central Europe is not viable anymore. So the nationalists in the multiple ethnicities in Austria-Hungary turn back to this old notion of Austrian protection, basically.
Okay. So would you say the policies and the actions that the Austrian-Hungarian Empire made within KR was more important than the results of the war, or was it in order for it to stay union together, united, or would you say?
Because there's a good chance that even if Austria-Hungary wins the war, if it didn't do these reforms, it would absolutely have collapsed. There's no way. There was just way too much discontent for the way the war was conducted in the first few years of the war.
Okay, cool. I'll go on to the next question because it's still about this topic anyway. Again, it's from Sava61, and it's since the Hungarian Soviet Republic never conceived in 1919, like in our timeline. What is the status on many of the Hungarian syndicalists in the region?
Right. Basically, of course, the Sava's correct that Hungary, Soviet Republic does not happen.
Yeah.
But the discontent in the left in Hungary predates even World War One. And I was doing some brief rereading last night, and there were some labor troubles. We're talking about general strikes going violent in 1912, as early as that. And so there's still leftist discontent, even if like the revolution that led to the Hungarian Soviet Republic, the what do you call it? Like the seeds were already there, so they have to go somewhere, right?
Yeah.
This isn't really applied in the current version of the game of KR, but there are some leftist discontent in Hungary, and it kind of boils over in the mid-20s, especially as the reforms fail. And I'll divulge more when we get when the Austro-Hungary rework is further along. But basically, like the guy that asked the question asked for specific people like Bela Kun and Matthias Rakosi. I can say for a fact that currently in the game they're mentioned in an event if you play as Hungary. Basically, they go for the Totalist Charter. In reality, those two might not even be alive in KR because they were in Russia during the Civil War. So they might not even be able to come back. We'll see once the rework goes along, but yeah, they might not even be there. The other guy he asked was Sandor Garbai, who was still in Hungary, and he's in exile by 1936. He's in France now as a trade union leader. He fled when the troubles got too bad.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later on with other questions as well, and with maybe in the future as well with another stream. If there's an Austria-Hungary stream, I don't know. I don't organize these things, but we'll move on. We'll move on. This is from right now. I'm going to struggle with this one. It's either methyl tilta or it's methyl later. I don't know. But the question is, this is for Flame, so it's about East Asia again. What exactly is Wang Jingwei's ideology?
This is a tough question because his leftist ideology in real history was not sort of fully formed in some respects. It was, the way it was carried out was influenced by the Soviet Union to some degree. And then on top of that, the stuff that he was ostensibly building his ideas off of, which was Sun Yat-sen's, principles, were never fully articulated in many respects. So in some ways here we are painting with sort of broad strokes when we're talking about Wang Jingwei. What I can say though is like one thing we've looked at in particular is the issue of land reform. That's something that's been a major question in Chinese history for a long time. How do you reform all of these farms without disrupting the fundamentals of society? Of course, Wang Jingwei does want to do that, actually. He wants to disrupt the old system, but you have to disrupt it in a way that, comes out in a functioning manner. You need to produce something at the end that actually works. So
you need to go from one
essentially
system to another. You can't just get rid of one system and not have something in preparation, something that is going to be functional, something that's prepared.
Exactly. So question of land reform is basically answered through one of Sun Yat-sen's sort of main economic ideas was basically the idea that land should be taxed heavily, to put it super simply. So the KMT's approach, or at least Wang Jingwei thought's approach, is to charge a really high land tax proportionate to the amount of land that is owned by landlords, because most farms at this time in China were owned by landlords. And then basically either the landlord can pay or he cannot. And if he's unable to pay, which most should be because, it's a very high tax, can sell their land to the government. They retain maybe 40% of it, so a less than controlling kind of share of it. And they get the value of the rest in a state-owned enterprise. So it's supposed to be like a kind of a system where they retain some value, so they're not all pissed off and going to start revolutions and rebellions and things. But you're also making that transition. And so in those cases, 60% of the land is given to peasants associations. So a little bit like communes, but not 100% the same. Those are formed for each of these villages, and then they redistribute the land among themselves with government oversight.
Okay.
And then the landlords are members of these associations as well. So again, the landlords that had to sell their land, so they still have 40%, but 40% is less than a controlling share. So decision-making actually is in the hands of the peasants collectively. And then eventually, according to Wang Jingwei thought anyway, these landowners, even with only 40% of the land, should eventually become enabled to pay even for their 40% of it, or they should essentially be outcompeted by the peasants associations, because ostensibly this collective method of ownership is more. So eventually they should basically be bought out by the peasants associations, and you end up with a society that's almost all regular farmers instead of landlords. The rest of his ideology is basically nationalist, fairly top down. So people's tutelage kind of thing. The people need to be educated and guided until they can sort of rule for themselves through democracy, ostensibly.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a tough question because we don't know precisely all the answers to it. And KR, as much as it is in-depth mod and everything, it's hard for us to map out all the exact economics and policies.
It sounds like he's much more focused on kind of like a transitional period that needs to happen rather than the end result. Like he has an idea of what the end result is, what he wants for China, but it's that he wants to figure out the best way in order to get to that goal rather than thinking about operating society as a whole.
Yeah, in a lot of respects. I mean, basically, he wants to just fundamentally disrupt the old system and replace it with something that,
Yeah.
again, ostensibly, yeah.
And he has strong opinions on how that will be achieved and how that should transfer across.
Right.
Okay, we're going to your next question. This is from Tarquin, and it's with Germany basically stealing East Asia from Britain and France. How influential were the US and Japan in trying to curb their influence?
So that's a very good question. And really, the whole situation of East Asia and Kaiserreich can kind of be, well, you can look for its roots about 35, 36 years before with the Boxer Rebellion. And a lot of people might think, oh, you're referencing the Boxers and all that stuff. But what I'm actually referencing is the positions of the different powers. So really, they were all competing over a position in China. You know, who would get the best deal, basically, who would get the biggest slice of. And that relationship actually, despite the changes of, say, in our own timeline, Germany losing the war, that kind of relationship continued well into the 1930s. The United States was trying to set up a situation where everybody could trade equally. And because the US had the biggest economy, it would always do, it would outcompete the others in an equal setting. Japan was trying to push its way in, and Britain was trying to kind of hold on to what it had. In this situation, Germany kind of replaces Britain, and it is trying to hold on to what it has. And the US and Japan are trying to push their own agendas. So they were absolutely a major part of what was going on. Japan was very, very concerned about what Germany was doing by taking essentially Britain's land. You have this whole situation in China, which we talked about in some teasers, with the scramble for Shanghai, or the Shanghai Scramble, where you've got the US, Japan, and Germany kind of competing over the remains of British rule in China in the concessions. And really, that only ends with a treaty, sort of treaty, a little bit like the Korean War, where there's kind of an armistice in sort of 1928 and 1929, where they kind of have a peace. But of course, like the Korean War, it never truly ended, and that will play out after 1936.
Okay, and there are things in game for that to procure.
Absolutely. I mean, the U.S. kind of drops out because of its own internal civil war, of course, once that starts, and that's actually kind of the trigger for Japan and Germany really starting to compete again in a major way. I mean, Black Monday starts it off, but the U.S. pulling out and sort of ceasing to be a mediating influence between the other two powers means that they can really, go out.
Yeah. Okay. Paul, do you have anything to add on to that at all?
No, I think Flame's answer there is really incredibly comprehensive, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
It pretty well describes what the US is up to. In terms of, I guess I could tell you that in terms of how the legation cities interact with some of that, the US Civil War is the big trigger after Black Monday, because Black Monday is a huge financial hit for places like Hong Kong and Shanghai, where a lot of the business that's done in them is in land sales and speculation and in stock trading. Black Monday is a huge hit for them that collapsed the German stock market and has repercussions all throughout Asia. But the bigger hit for them really is the US Civil War, as that kicking off kind of removes, to a certain extent, the big 10-ton bear in the room that's been sort of holding Germany and Japan back from each other, and that can very quickly escalate. And in-game, it pretty much inevitably leads to a war in the Pacific as well.
Okay. So we're gonna flip back over to Austria-Hungary now. It's another question from Tarquin though, and they ask, what's the in-law reason for the Hungarians being whiny, resistant to Karl's federalization attempts?
All right, like I mentioned earlier, like the Hungarian aristocracy is incredibly powerful politically, and they basically control the political system through gerrymandering and just literally like not everyone. There's no universal suffrage in Hungary at that point, so not everyone even votes. And what makes them resistant is basically they want to protect their privileges. That's the short answer, and they they just want to keep their power, their hold on power. And hold on, that's going to be a moment.
Okay, no worries. We haven't had this situation before. I could move on to the next question for now, or we.
Well, I mean, Vij is a family man, so he's got time to get. I think basically what he's getting at is the reason the Hungarians are whiny is that the Hungarian elite is in a very dominant position over not just Hungarians, but a lot of non-Hungarians as well. They benefit from a very controlled, probably in game terms, all of them Passort style situation where there's not universal suffrage hasn't even happened yet, and they can rig the elections to a greater or less kind of softly, not fully. So they have a lot to lose from federalization, probably more than anyone else.
Yeah, I'm back. Thank you, Paul. It's basically a Hungary like before World War One historically is basically a thinly veiled oligarchy where the power is in the hands of a few big influential families, and they are afraid of the reforms that the emperor is trying to force in because it attacks their strangle on power.
Yes.
And that historically this continued until like 1945. Like the hold on the aristocracy was just that strong. It survived like a communist revolution in 1919 and only was destroyed by basically the Soviet army.
I wonder what happened in 1945.
Oh, mysterious.
It sounds to me like it should really be a Hungary-Austria empire at this point, or even just a Hungarian empire.
Yes and no.
Hey, that's what the Hungarians wanted. I'm not even joking. They actually tried to usurp Vienna as the center of the empire several times in history.
Basically, when you're trying to ask a question about like what's up in Austria-Hungary, bet on Hungarians being bastards.
Noblemen be bastards, at least.
Well,
most of the Hungarian
yes,
ones.
They just all happen to be Hungarian.
They kind of realized how bad of an idea it was to be this much of a jerk when basically the whole country was collapsing.
Yeah,
Maybe we shouldn't be assholes.
It worked on two parliaments at this point, didn't it?
Yeah, it had two parliaments.
Yeah.
You want to put it in KR terms, you basically have like one half that's like odd dem for the most part, and the other part is, I guess, also odd dem, but like there's no democracy in the central governing of both halves of the empire. I could go on about the whole structure of the empire, but that's just going to bore everyone. So I'm not gonna.
Everyone else within the empire just kind of has to suck it up and watch mum and dad fight.
Kinda.
Right. We'll move on
At
to the
least
next
they have
question.
political representation in half the empire.
Not to worry, we're still represented in half an empire.
Right. Moving on, we've got a question from Hole Fixer. This is about Britain, and the question is, what is life like in the Union of Britain, Paul?
Oh, it's a big one. This is the one. This is actually the question I liked best, and the one I wanted to put some thought into answering. But the trouble is, the answer is boring. Not the answer itself, although that answer is also boring. The answer is just boring. What's life like for you normally? You get up, you go to work, you read the papers. The big difference is sort of what papers you're reading, what politicians you're discussing, what you're hearing about in the world. I guess as always, the biggest difference is, well, obviously, like, who you're talking about in particular. So, like the people at the top, your Tom Manns, your Oswald Mosleys, are a lot more prominent compared to all of your real life figures. You're a little less politically free, obviously. There is a certain amount of press censorship. There's the Ministry of Public Information is a thing. In the rework, we're changing the nature of the RED, which is something I'll expound on more later when that makes more progress. Because currently it's a little frozen on code right now because our other dev, Virtual Hummingbird, who was working on it, is in absentia for, he probably has his own reasons, and I'm working on China and then Spain afterwards. In any case, the major other difference I would say is probably the British diet. And unfortunately as well, the answer to that one is, once again, boring.
Brown.
It's a bit, pretty much. It's a bit different because I did. It's a question that fascinated me because it's instinctive, the reaction, isn't it? It's like, Britain imports its food, doesn't it? How can it feed itself? But while I was doing reading on, Britain feeding itself during World War II in real life, and the issues they encountered in World War One, I realised that they learned a lot of lessons from World War One in particular, and the fact that the country was about 6 weeks from starvation during that. And Britain was largely, there were some studies done in the 1930s before the war started in earnest, and before rationing was brought in 1940, on could a group of people on a diet that was slightly less than the official ration feed themselves and do vigorous outdoor work every day? And the answer is yes. There was no problems except for, I believe, the testers reported shocking increase in flatulence, just from the sheer amount of vegetable matter you have to intake. But things like potatoes, vegetables, fish, wholemeal bread were never rationed during the war. There were big advisory pamphlets put around as well, telling people, potatoes, not just for serving with meat, you can use them instead of bread, which is made from cereals, which we have to import. Save shipping space, use potatoes. So, like, the British diet largely would consist of potatoes, a little meat, however much fish you could afford that day, etc. And therefore it is quite boring as well, because the big thing is there's a lack of cereals, so you don't get a lot of stuff that's made with flour, so white bread, cakes, etc. There's no tropical fruit like oranges or bananas. There's almost definitely no real access to sugar. Tea would be in quite short supply. And as I'm saying this,
about the tea?
I was going to say, as I'm saying this, I know Ben is sort of sitting there like, this sounds like hell. Where are we? So no sugar, shortage of milk as well, like dairy products.
Not my Britain.
So, like, you can't even have tea with milk, 2 sugars. It's abominable. Why would you ever live there? This is why people fled to Canada. Coffee's unheard of. One of the interesting things, cotton would probably also be in short supply. Me and Betweens, we planned some interesting flavour events about, like, people, as a result of textile rationing, moving away from things like wearing hats, or a movement to discard the institution of wearing ties, in changes in fashion in that sense. Summarised, though, life in the Union of Britain is a lot like it was in real life in our timeline. It's a bit more Spartan, it's a bit less politically free. But if you were to teleport a person from Britain in 1940 in real life into Britain in 1940 in Kaiserreich, and give them a primer on the basics of we're at war with Germany and there's rationing on, I think the only thing they'd really find shocking is that Oswald Mosley is a prominent politician. So yeah, your answer in that case is boring.
Okay, all right. Well, the real plot twist to this whole development is I don't even drink tea. That's the worst thing. So I don't even think it would be bad for me. I think I'd be all right.
Scandal.
Big scandals now.
That's a crime.
Yeah, narrator Ben doesn't even drink tea. What are we going to do now, boys?
Are you saying that the Frenchie in this channel is drinking more tea than a Brit? What
Oh,
Actually, confession time. I don't even drink that much tea. I sold my soul to the Coca-Cola Corporation a long time ago.
Oh man.
oh dear, oh dear. Right, let's move on. Next
Not even
question.
iced tea.
Not even iced tea. Ooh.
Next question. Next question.
Next question. This is from Joaquin Augusto. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is another question about Austria-Hungary, so it's for you, Vidya. Maybe you as well, a little bit, Droz. How are countries like Argentina and Austria-Hungary represented in the world map?
Well, Biggie, do you want to start or should I?
Sure, I'll start.
Alright.
If you look at maps from before World War I, you'll usually see Austria-Hungary as one big blob of the single color. So the answer really depends on the detail of the map. So usually it's pretty much in all cases going to be one single color on a world map. If it's a more zoomed in map or with more detail, sometimes you'll see the inner borders. Usually it's going to be the Austrian half and the Hungarian half. And if you get a really, really accurate map, then you'll see the subdivisions of the Austrian half. But yeah, it's usually just one color and sometimes inner borders.
Yeah. Sounds about
Yeah,
right.
in the case of Argentina, which is in a situation of a lot of civil strife, it really varies depending on political orientation and ability of the cartographer on the subject. Basically, on January 1936, a map would show Argentina as either a single unified entity, representing that they acknowledge that Argentina owns all of that land and that the Southern Rebellion is illegitimate and that this state's revolt doesn't really matter. Or they could show Buenos Aires as a separate entity with the states being all around, neither united nor separate because they're technically all acknowledging the constitution, they're just not acknowledging the government. Or you could find maps that have, well, what we have in KR, which is the northern half, which is a single political entity, sorry, not unity, a single political entity, but that with some provinces that don't recognize the central government.
So it's essentially similar to, I think, Sudan, like 10 years ago or so. It was like disputed territory before they officially became North and South Sudan. Is that right? Am I talking rubbish?
Maybe like Kashmir.
Yeah, maybe like Kashmir.
You know, you get like dotted lines, or like French maps will be like, yep, this is all the Argentine commune. These bits are just held by rebel government. And Canadian maps will be like, yep, this is all Argentina. These bits are held by rebel government. And then maps from countries that don't care kind of have like dotted line of like in dispute.
Or even maps of China.
Or just show the whole thing being a single political entity, which is really not a thing, but if they don't care, they won't care a lot.
Yeah, fair. They're just like, I like to imagine for other things like that, like post-Middle Africa collapse for about 10 years, the maps are just made with a giant question mark.
The border is just a pattern of just question marks all along it.
Country of, we don't know.
Something like this, I reckon.
Someone brought a good point. Actually, the same question could be applied to China if Flame wants to answer that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you know, this kind of happened in real history. If you look at China in like 1924, 1925, large portions of the country fighting each other. But really, the big difference between that and, say, the U.S. Civil War, like the historical Civil War that happened in, you know, the mid-1800s, is that, you know, the South from the United States actually seceded. They were creating their own country, technically. Whereas all these different groups in China, at least until 1928, 1929, in the Kaiserreich timeline, are all ostensibly still part of the same country. They're just fighting, they're just disagreeing with the central government, and kind of trying to push for their own autonomy within it. The big difference happens, as I kind of just said, in 1928 and kind of 1929, when, you know, the Feng Xian government essentially breaks away and says, you know, we're our own country. So if you look at maps, if you were to look at maps, I should say, in the Kaiserreich timeline, China would be one whole country until that point. And then after then, you know, you'd probably, in most cases, you'd probably see the Northeast as its own little area, with the rest being labeled China.
Okay.
Yeah.
So similar to the War of the Three Kingdoms, or am I missing the target here?
You mean the
All the
period like
clans.
hundreds and hundreds of years
Yeah,
ago?
yeah.
I mean, I guess he's got a sort of point in that you have like a chunk of it that's just trying to, like the Kingdom of Wu's trying to be their own thing, and then you have Wei and Shu disputing legitimacy of control over the Han Dynasty until right at the end.
Yeah, a little bit like that. It's comparable. Yeah, it depends on which period in the history you're talking about, especially because like after a certain point, each of the three, kingdoms were functioning more like kingdoms than just independent parts of the same. But yeah, there's definitely comparisons you can make.
Yeah.
I-
We won't go too much into that because we're getting straying away a little bit.
I will say, I think just on the topic of like how it would be better represented in a video game, we have all kind of agreed at various points in time. It would be easier to represent the state of like China in the 1920s through Crusader Kings 2 mod.
Oh, definitely.
Than it would with like Hearts of Iron 4 or even Victoria 2, because you've got each little individual warlord controls a province and calls up his levies, who he can throw together with guns. And he's called on by another warlord, who's called on by another warlord, and they all go have a big fight.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that even
of the game, really.
Yeah, it even extends to the way combat was fought. Like a lot of these wars in China at this time were fought, with a couple of really decisive battles. There were some exceptions to that. There were some, larger wars where it was really more like World War One, like push and pull across borders. But like, especially some of the earlier wars, you have sort of two armies that both are coming along a train track, and then they, fight each other, and then whoever wins kind of wins the war because the other side's army's dead, or routed, I should say.
Yeah, there's a certain almost medieval logic to it in the same sense as like you would try to avoid giving battle unless you really had to, because you could decisively lose a battle and your strength is broken. It would more be conducted with like a whole interconnecting web of like, these guys are here, they'll go raid this place and we'll crawl up this bit and have these people acknowledge our authority, and we'll take back supplies that we can loot from this, and then everyone goes home for the harvest. So yeah, sorry if I'm talking a bit much on something that's not really my topic. I was a medievalist in university, so I kind of know how like that sort of feudal style warfare is fought.
It's pretty similar, especially earlier on in the warlord period.
I guess summary would be it's kind of always difficult to represent things on a map because it's never an entire picture of what's going on anyway.
Yep.
All right. Well, we've got a couple more questions, and then I think we'll take a break. So we've got another question from Ragob12. This is about Brazil. So what were the impacts of the French and the British revolutions on the political life of Brazil? Over to you, Draws.
Well, on the left-wing movements, there was clearly an impact as they had now a Western nation to look out for socialism, which is unlike it happened in our timeline where the mostly Francophile and mostly the Francophile and Anglophile intellectual groups just didn't have, because Britain and France obviously weren't communist in our time or socialist in general, and so the Russian communism didn't catch up as fast with Brazilian movements. Other than that, there isn't really that much to elaborate because Francophilia and Anglophilia, I think it's called, weren't really that prevalent outside of intellectual groups. So, like, if you were a construction worker in Rio, you wouldn't really feel the difference between France being communist and England being communist.
Yeah.
They're not part of your daily life, so it doesn't really matter.
Okay, well, we'll move on to the next question. Same person again. How has the divergent history of Italy and Europe in general affected? How did it affect the massive influx of immigrants that Brazil received?
Well, in general, immigration to South America had already peaked and was already slowing down by the 1930s. The only major nation that kept receiving increasing amounts of immigrants was Argentina. And while I can see a few slight changes in the amount of people coming from, for example, Italy, which is now split into 5 parts, with people fleeing en masse, or Spain, which is slightly on a worse situation, there's really not much difference between the immigrant influx towards South America in general, other than maybe a few tweaks here and there from their original, how do you say, from the original party location. Basically, maybe you will get a few more Russians, because Russia is fire, essentially, by 1936. And maybe a few more Italians, and that's about it. There's not really a huge percentage of change between one timeline and the other.
Okay. Right. Well, I think at that point we'll take a short break. I don't know how long our break normally is. How long is our break?
I think we went for like 10 or 15 minutes.
10 or 15 minutes, yeah.
Oh, thank God, I'm parched.
Okay. So if we reconvene in the next 10 minutes, so at the next stroke of the hour, that's when we will reconvene.
Cool.
Sounds good.
So if our
so jealous of Dennis and his ship girls.
Right, I believe we're back. So, welcome back, one and all. We're going to the second part of the question and answer. After this section, we will have a questions to the audience. I guess we'll be taking questions from the chat, but for now, we'll carry on. So, this next question's again from Tarquin, and it is: how did the concept of South Slav nation development differ in the interwar Austria-Hungary versus Yugoslavia?
So it sounds like it could be an in-depth question, but it's really not. The answer is that the Yugoslavist movement in Croatia and like the parts of the Habsburg Empire that had South Slavs were more federally oriented. So they wanted to form a South Slavic state, but they wanted to be more autonomy for the different types of South Slavs. So the big difference is that within Austria-Hungary, like the Croats especially, they still lean towards more of a federation, while the Serbs can want more of a centralized Yugoslavia.
Okay. Is that it? Is that the be all end all of that question?
Basically.
Okay. Okay. On to your next question then. What are the main political parties in Hungary that support it breaking away or fighting for independence against Austria, or are there none?
The major opposition for the Austrians is the Padouts, the paternal autocrat.
Yep.
And what they're mostly like they will avoid fighting Austria until they have to, but they are willing to, unlike the opposition. And then you also have the national populace that just want independence as soon as possible, and right now, and they hate the Austrians. Other than that, basically every party in Hungary is at least autonomist, so they will not accept like basically being military occupied, to say the least. Like there's no real support for such a centralized Austrian Empire.
Gotcha. Okay. Next question is from Electronic Echo, and the question is: can you explain what happened in the rest of the British Empire during and after the revolution in the Home Isles?
So this is a
Flame. Yes.
Yeah, this is a big question because I mean you're talking about a huge amount of area. One way I kind of like to explain it though is that I don't know if anybody's seen the show called Stranger Things on Netflix, but
Ooh.
the owner of that show, or the writer I should say, basically said that there was no way that story could have happened if it was set in the modern day, because everybody would have just had cell phones and they would have just said like, oh, I'll just take a picture of this monster and I'll just, tell everybody where it is, in real time by texting
Yeah.
or something like that. Well, in the British Empire at this time, pretty much everything outside, well, pretty much everything is connected by telegraph and telephone to some degree. But over long distances, you're often using telegraph because it was cheaper and things like that. And you wouldn't have to worry so much about, time differences and
Yeah. And not all of the British Empire is developed at the same level as well.
Yeah,
Right.
In like really rural parts of the empire, like in India, for instance, like if someone in, say, rural Bengal wants to hear about the British Revolution, it's going to take months.
Yeah, exactly. So, there's often been the saying that also, the British Empire was kind of held together by like less than 100 people in the colonial office, just like, running telegraph machines, basically.
And some of that is the colonial office trying to make themselves look good, but yeah.
Yeah. But basically, there were relatively few lines of communication. They were relatively slow, and the empire was quite disparate in its, development. So the result of that really is that you have kind of a slow motion kind of collapse. It's not like everything just falls apart instantly. It's more like all these different places kind of go, oh, the home isles are kind of not where they should be. They're not really able to back us up anymore, for instance. So what are we going to do? And that manifests differently in different places. Like, I mean, Paul could probably talk more about Australia, but one
little.
thing that happened. A little more than me, probably.
Yeah, Australia. the trouble is you've got two people who know what they're talking about with the British Empire here, but Australia isn't really either of them's department. Like, I could tell you a little bit about Australia, but in really broad strokes, and I could tell you a fair bit about Isles, because as it currently stands with internal Kaiserreich law stuff, I wrote that.
Oh.
So, one thing I will say is the reworked timelines where the British Revolution is less what it is currently, which is there's a big strike in 1925 and the whole country goes kaput. It's more like you start with the big strike in 1925 and then everything kind of gradually escalates and escalates. And you hit DEFCON 1, get out, run away to Canada into 1927.
Yeah, and so in other parts of the empire, you get basically what happens in Australia in general is that it's believed that there's some kind of civil uprising that's going to happen, syndicalists, etc. So they pull a lot of the China station, so like the British naval forces in East Asia, back to Australia to help deal with that. So you have all these colonies, all these concessions, etc., that just kind of don't really have any backup. And a lot of the British Empire, a lot of colonial empires were held together by essentially the promise that if you rise up against your ruler, sure, you might in theory take them over and defeat them in some battles, and you might even take over the capital or wherever you are, but in good time the British fleet's going to come around and you're going to be destroyed. Well, when that fleet's gone, that promise is no longer.
Alexa, play Rule Britannia.
Yeah, it was one of the things while I was reading about India, one of the things I realized is a lot of people were convinced of, and most of my reading about India has been done out of both intellectual curiosity and for educational purposes in like the 18th, 19th century. But the mentality did continue into the 20th, is that a lot of people were convinced of, the civilizing mission in India. They were there to uplift a people who were clearly capable of great civilization, but were currently savages out of the dirt. But the people on the ground in India who were running it understood that the way you kept India in line was the constant threat of redcoats marching in and shooting people. So it was a classic one is there was unrest in Sindh at one point, and when Wellington was the Governor General or the Viceroy, he essentially stated that he could subdue it all as long as he had 200 British cavalrymen, and that, as Flame Fang says, that threat of force of military might in a lot of the colonies is suddenly taken away. And it leaves them in a kind of big question mark, handing over their existence and the whole issue of consent of the governed.
Right, which is kind of where Germany comes in to some degree. Certainly for these sort of smaller East Asian concessions and things, because suddenly they're at risk of being maybe overrun, maybe uprisen again. So the Germans can sort of provide this promise all over again, but instead of the Royal Navy, it's the Germans. And so you kind of get a give or take situation, or give and take, I should say, where the Germans provide the necessary force, but the remaining British authorities are able to actually, keep people in line, actually run things. They know where the buttons. Because
they speak the language.
Yes, the language is a really big, important part. That's something I'll talk about in one of the later questions.
Was there a huge influx of populists to Canada, apart from obviously the higher ups, but like from day to day, like normal people, was there quite a big influx of that as well?
This is one of those issues that really depends a lot on internal British stuff, and is also like one of the ones we've been up in the air answering, because there's a few different dimensions to it. One is what can like realistically happen, is who would move, how would they move, and how would when would they get there. The other is how much can Canada really take, and the other aspect of it is in-game stuff. So currently, if you actually do some analysis, you realize that as it currently stands in the game, Britain is in deficit maybe around 2 million population. It's actually in deficit 3 million, but 1 million of them live in Northern Ireland. 2 million population over where it was in real life, but Canada is up 5 million. So there's a sort of 3 million shadow Canadians that exist, and that's a sort of dissonance within the game. There was a discussion fairly recently about like the outflow of people and who and why would move. I believe we settled on a number that's lower than both of those that will be properly revealed in good time and when I can find the bit in the chat about it.
Okay, right. Enough about that. Go on to another question. This is from No, wait. Yes, I'm correct. This is about Britain still, but in the British Republican Navy, how commonplace are coal-powered warships compared to oil-powered ones?
Okay, so this is a thing that got a little traction on the Kaiserreich subreddit recently, which I moderate, so I am aware of it. And it's... okay. It makes a twisted kind of sense if you are completely unaware of a bunch of the problems with coal-powered warships that cause the move away from them. Britain has lots of coal. Britain doesn't have lots of oil. Why doesn't Britain use coal? The answer, essentially, is modern naval designs aren't made for using coal. Things like coal-oil hybrid stuff was mostly done for the transition to fuel. And there's huge issues with coaling a ship. So coaling a ship is what it sounds like. It's a simple process of taking on coal so a coal-powered steamship can move. Sailors hated doing it. It was dirty, but it had to be done. And you needed to sail into a friendly port with the Collier on side, during which time the ship is completely unoperational because you need all hands on deck to move a hell of a lot of coal. You need only look at some of the problems that the Russian Baltic fleet had going around the world to Tsushima Bay to get blown up by the Japanese in real life when the British denied them coaling facilities. What they had to do was their, I believe it was their battle ships, I forget the name of the class because I can't pronounce it, had a safe maximum of around 11,000 tons of coal they could carry. And they already sat about 2 feet lower in the water carrying that than they were supposed to. They ended up taking on 22,000 each for the journey. And
is this the Russo-Japanese
This is the
War?
Russians, right? Russo-Japanese War, yeah. This is
Yeah.
their battleships then. They ended up having to take on 22,000 tons, so double what they were supposed to carry, to the point they had coal piled up on the main deck, even. Sailors would have to, like, bite down on big cotton rags to avoid breathing in coal dust constantly. So coal is dirty, coal is hard to carry, you can't pump coal. Obviously, you can pump oil, and you can store oil a lot more efficiently, and it burns a lot more efficiently as well. Plus, oil-burning engines don't need people to constantly shovel the fuel into them. Further to that, warships which are caught coaling are, as I say, unable to fight, and they are stationary, they are sitting ducks. It was noted during World War I, when the British battle cruisers were in the Falklands, they were coaling, that the Germans missed a golden opportunity to have attacked them and essentially knock out the British fleet in the South Pacific at that point. Now, Britain did operate coal-powered ships for a long time, but one of the animuses that drove the British Empire to seize places like, say, Malta, like Mauritius, like little naval bases all around the world, was the need for coaling stations. And one thing the Union of Britain does not have is good access to coaling stations, but one thing the Union of Britain needs is to be able to project sea power at long range, potentially all the way to Canada, if it comes to a war between them and they need to launch some sort of invasion. Or, all the way down to the coast of Africa, for instance, to support the French in attacking National France. And you just can't do that with coal ships when your nearest friendly coaling station that you're guaranteed to be able to use is Bordeaux. Imagine if you're having to operate, you've managed to pass through Gibraltar by hook or by crook, and you're having to fight a naval action off of Tunis using a coal-powered ship, and you know that if which by chance you should, have some issue with your cargo of coal, or you should burn through it faster than you've estimated, you're going to be absolutely stuck and unable to do anything unless you can somehow limp all the way back to Marseille or Bordeaux with enemy ships prowling around. It's just not feasible. Like, coal-powered ships are inefficient, vulnerable, they require extensive coal supplies, which Britain has, but not locally to where they want to operate their navy, necessarily. And you need a wide-ranging network of friendly port facilities in order to keep them operational. Coal-powered ships would not really be common within the British Navy, if used at all, by the 1930s.
Okay. All right. So leading on to that, the next question is, what happens to the Royal Navy after the 1925 British Revolution? And that question is from Thin Incident 7.
Hoo-hoo. I laugh about that. The answer really is we had a very capable naval rework team who, through a process I can only describe as anal retentive and weird, went through just about every ship of the British Navy prior to World War I and decided, where would these be? So if you look into a lot of the in-game ships, you'll find they were distributed between various tags. So the Ottoman Empire got a few ended up in Germany with Austria, some with the French. A good huge chunk of them, particularly the ones that were built post-war, are with the Union of Britain. Most of the rest are with Canada. Some are in Australasia. I think there's a couple that are with the German Ostasian Flotte. And then a few are in the West Indies Federation. So the Royal Navy is sort of scattered around. As to what happened to the Royal Navy's command hierarchy, it regionalised, basically. All the people who were in the Caribbean or in North America, they end up in Canada. A good chunk of the people who were in Britain, obviously they flee to Canada as well, along with a lot of the officer corps. Australasia pretty much contains most of the British Pacific Navy. The Dominion of India has like one dockyard and all of about 3 ships, I think. So they have, I forget if their admiral list is that significant, but it's not very extensive, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The real answer is the British Navy is all over the place. The Royal Navy is obviously what calls itself the Royal Navy is now in Canada and is trying to puzzle out sort of controlling the North Atlantic and sailing troops all the way to Britain in order to launch a naval invasion of the home islands. And they are, if you like, driving a lot of the decisions, such as aggression towards Denmark in order to grab Greenland and Iceland, and foreign policy as it relates to Ireland, attempting to woo them round. The Republican Navy, meanwhile, is largely gearing up for if a naval war on 2 fronts, essentially. So contesting the North Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic, even as far as the Caribbean, with Canada and the Entente in general, and also controlling the North Sea. There's a bunch of stuff in the rework about where you're focusing and what you're focusing on navally for the Union of Britain, and various like operations, if you like, some of which are based on real life naval operations to attack and control certain targets in order to enhance your naval position.
Okay. I don't think I have anything to ask about that, so we'll move on. This isn't so much a law question as such, but it's a question more so about the development of Kaiserreich. Going back to the China update, this is from Hippie Hippie Hurrah. For the China update, did you start with any themes you wanted to address in the law gameplay, or did they develop organically as you worked on the project? I mean, obviously, Flame, you worked quite extensively on China, and it's probably a question best asked for you, but everyone can take part in this question as well if you have anything to contribute.
Yeah, I mean, everybody here has worked in some capacity on the China work.
Yeah.
So they're welcome to chime in.
Me and
This
the
is
boys
kind of
about to work on the China rework.
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting question, just because I think we might all interpret themes a little differently here. Like, I would say that, most of the China rework is really just built trying to fit the old legacy lore into something that makes a lot more sense, essentially, which has been keeping a couple things around like Qing, like the AOG, etc. But like in terms of more general themes, I'd say some of the things that I've wanted to insert in there are just how crazy China was at this time, really, more than 1920s historically. And the 1920s historically are kind of pushed forward in some ways into the 1930s and Kaiserreich's timeline because the warlord era never really ends. Or at least, not until 1936. We'll see what, players do with it later. But yeah, I mean, you're talking about a country where, huge portions of sort of civil society broke down. The legitimacy of the government broke down, and you have all these really interesting characters that are running an almost kind of feudal society, but also not, like distinctly not feudal, distinctly Chinese certainly. But it's also another one of these kinds of themes that I guess I sort of wanted to include is the way at this time China was a bit of a historical estuary. That's a term Dan Carlin uses on occasion, if anybody's familiar with him. And I think it applies very well here because you've got like different kinds of technology and attitudes from different kind of centuries and times mixing together. You've got guys fighting with swords against people with machine guns and planes and tanks. So I also kind of wanted to showcase that a bit. It's hard to do with Hearts of Iron 4 because it's just not designed to do that kind of thing. The kinds of wars that you fight in Hearts of Iron 4 are not the kinds of wars that they fought in China. But we do. I'd be interested to see what the others have to say to this question, though, because it's interesting.
Who wants to go next?
Well, for me, because Flame talks about like the general direction of China as a whole. I believe the tag he's done the most work on is actually the Fengtian government, and a lot of that is like it interacts both with the existing legacy content, but it's also interacting with the new content and getting a bit of a revamp for it, right? Yeah. Whereas like I know Droz has worked on Yunnan, and Vidya is Liangguang, and I'm the legation cities. So they're sort of very different areas of it. Within the legation cities, I guess the theme, so to speak, is just that like constantly everything is about agendas. Like different people may be working together, or different people are doing the same kind of thing at the same time, but everyone has something they want. The British are. I'll summarize. Within the legation cities, there are essentially 5 major factions. There's the Japanese, the Germans, the Americans, the British, and the Chinese, each represented by the popularity of a different party. Japanese, the National Populists, they consist of both Japanese and Chinese collaborators. And their goal essentially is to bring the cities into the Chinese, into the sphere of the Fengtian government, failing that into the Japanese sphere directly. The goal of the Germans is essentially like keep China open for German trade, and if possible, edge out everyone else. Just clear them off. They're one of the more passive kind of factions, but they are still significant. And they are rich and they are powerful. The Chinese, we discussed, their goal is essentially take over, annex the legation cities into the appropriate tag that aligns with them ideologically. British, the Americans, after the American Civil War starts, their goal is survive, but also to keep on going the open door policy. They're sort of the status quo faction. And then the British, really the British focus around Hong Kong, and their actual goal is to, if they gain enough influence, they don't take over the legation cities themselves. They use their influence to force the legation cities into a sort of political deadlock and try and slip Hong Kong out of it, so to speak, and back into the empire. And that is the theme of the legation cities, is essentially that you can lean into each of the individual factions depending on how you want to play, but ultimately everyone has their own agenda and you can't stay neutral forever. And I guess the theme with them almost is that, like, the era of the concessions in China is kind of coming to an end, and the people with their fingers on the pulse in the legation cities know it. It's just a question of who's going to win out of that.
Okay. Does anyone want to contribute something similar to as Paul has, but for their section of the China update?
Nothing I haven't already presented in the PR, so
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure about media.
You can read the Liang Guang PR.
Yeah, those are sort of presented already, so
Okay.
To be fair, it's worth noting that a good chunk of the fans cannot read and therefore probably need to be told.
Oh, well.
I guess you could say that the big part of Liang Guang is basically leading the Southern Republicans against the North, which will most likely be the Qing.
Yeah,
So it's basically... Sorry, go on.
No, I was saying Liang Guang is like, it's the leading light of Chinese federalism.
Yes, that's the main interfaction.
Yeah, federalism in China is an ideology that didn't really like take off in real life.
Okay, so going back to the initial question, was it a case that you used the legacy as the framework and then began researching, and then was it a case that when you were researching, I imagine it was a process that you did throughout the whole thing, but as you were researching, you thought, okay, well, we can tweak this legacy and it fits in this way, and then as that goes on, it's almost like it begins to steamroll, moving forward. As in, it's not a case of like you have like a flat. Okay, this is the plan. This is the legacy stuff. We're going to do this. It's more so. Oh, I've looked more and more into this, and this looks quite cool. We can do something with this. So
it really, really varies by tag and person. As I understand it, and Flame can disabuse me of anything I'm wrong about, the China rework was written sort of over the course of about like 2 years, and the first noises started being made about it in like 2014 or so.
Yeah.
And it was based on like people had studied the era. They realized that a lot of the legacy Kaiserreich content from Darkest Hour, with like the massive AOG and like Yunnan just eating Sichuan, for instance, is partly there out of gameplay constraints from Darkest Hour, where you need to have a small number of tags you can actually have in the game, which is the reason for like these big space-filling empires, if you like. And so the rework was born partly out of the goal of making China more historically authentic, but we took certain things that are considered like Kaiserreich's identity, so to speak, and we did our best to find a historical basis to justify them, like the Qing restoration.
So, hooking onto the question, did you find the China update was distinctively different to other updates you've done?
Yeah, it's larger than anything else. Basically.
It's massive. Like, good Christ, I don't know how Flamefang manages it.
Well, I don't always.
Well, yes, to an extent, I guess. Like, it's very regionalized. The China update is 20 plus tags with full content from 1936 to the late game. So just in sheer scope and scale, it's huge, and probably also represents the single biggest revision of legacy content, possibly ever.
Yeah, you also need to add up that basically every tag has at least 2 or 3 paths, which not always have the same flavor events or the same trees. So that's double the work or triple the work, depending on how many paths does it have.
Yeah, I mean that kind of ties into one of. I mean, you were asking about themes here. I guess you could say one of the themes with the China rework is that each of the tags is less and more a sort of path in and of itself. Which is quite different from what you'll find in a lot of other places, and this means that everything's tied together in a lot of kind of different ways. You know, somebody earlier on the subreddit was saying, "Oh, China's kind of like, you know, redoing all of Europe," and that's kind of accurate. But at the same time, because it's all one country, or most of it's one country, you know, you've got to also represent that like everybody's tied together. Everybody cares about what's happening everywhere else in China all at the same time. So yeah, it's a complicated matter. And yeah, I'd say that's almost part of the theme, like just the sheer chaos and complexity of it.
Yeah, I imagine if you were to try and do a regional rework of something like, say, for example, Europe, you can't really do it on the scale that you would with China.
Yeah, well, one of the big things about Europe is okay, I will first state one of the persistent sort of truisms of the Kaiserreich dev team, which is that working on Europe is sentencing yourself to a few months in hell because everyone has an opinion on it. And the other is that Europe is one of those things where, partly just because its history is so much more documented than almost anywhere else, and has been gone over endlessly by historians. Like, I mean, Flame's the authority on it within the team, and he can tell you, you know, 4 or 5 real good books to read about China in the 1920s. If you want to read about Germany in the 1920s, you're looking at a reading list of 30 plus. Like writing a proposal for a tag in Europe can feel a bit like writing a PhD thesis.
Yeah.
Whereas, and I'm not saying it's any different for China. Like, you know, proposing the China rework, you could probably have, you know, written a whole thesis about it yourself anyway. But it is easier to be an authority on tags outside of Europe in a way that you can't in Western Europe in particular. And so it is easier to push forward something like the China rework.
Okay.
You're right, you can't do that sort of thing on the same scale.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Well, let's remember that this is a law Q&A, so let's close that door for now and let's go on to some more questions. So the next question is from Sir Vikings. He asks, although the syndicalists control Great Britain, is there an underground movement that supports the king?
Oh, absolutely. One thing I would say is there's a lot of British history and pride tied up in the monarchy. I mean, I come from a particularly not rural, not any kind of rural. We're sort of suburban, and we're right near a big urban conglomeration, sometimes called a city. Otherwise called a hell pit. It's called Birmingham.
Yes.
Yeah, you probably are aware of it in your nightmares. But there's a kind of tangible sense when you talk to people about it. If you ask them about it, people know the monarchy is very important, and they can't really tell you precisely why. It's one of those things that's tied up with identity to a greater or lesser extent. There are monarchist sympathies within Britain, is what I would say. I would compare it to Jacobitism to a degree. Okay. I studied Jacobitism at A level and then a bit at university. And one of the key things about it is there were a lot of people who were Jacobites. They were, you know, perfectly happy to hold big Jacobite dinners and have all their friends over and toast, you know, King James or King Charles in exile and say, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if they were restored? There were very few people willing to go out and sleep under a hedge in the middle of December to make it happen. So British support for the king is present. It's strong in places like the Highlands, for instance, in Scotland, which have a very conservative religious outlook and a lot of pride in, like, you know, regiments of the Royal Army that are associated with them. The British Army, rather, the Royal. It's interesting because it's the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, but it's just the British Army. And that goes back to the new model army, yada, yada, yada. But there's a lot of military pride there as well. Places like the Midlands, which have historically been like a Tory stronghold, still are. and in bits of like the southwest, rural Britain essentially has monarchist sympathies, but they very much don't amount to like armed resistance or men in berets planning to blow up bridges and facilitate the king's return to Bristol or wherever. They largely amount to nostalgia almost. 10 years, like having big dinner parties and saying, wasn't it better 10 years ago when we lived under the king? And it's like, yes. Do you want to stage a revolution about it? No.
Not in my backyard.
Pretty much, yeah. There's an underground resistance movement is a strong way to put it, but Britain is enamoured of monarchist nostalgia in private. I would say the Union of Britain is. Yes.
Okay. So the next question, again about Britain, Paul. So this is from Mikhail Talta. I think I'm going to go with that as the name. How does the British economy get worse than in real life in such a way that a violent revolution is caused?
Yeah, this is one of those perpetually troublesome questions because the British economy really did just absolutely hit the rocks in real life. Sorry. It's tough to answer in a way that's satisfying, and it was one of the things I had to deal with writing the rework is how do you make what was arguably one of the absolute worst times for the British economy when it just crashed worse. Because the Americans, they had the Roaring '20s, and Britain experienced a little of that, but not very much because the imperial system was breaking down. Labor productivity was incredibly sluggish. Trade was being muscled out, not just by Japanese and German manufacturing after the German economy began to pick up a bit, but also by American manufacturing, because America had slowly, been spending the 19th century growing and growing and growing. And by the 20th, it kind of reaches critical mass. The US is at that point the world's biggest economy, and imperial preference and tariffs were brought in as an attempt to, but they were kind of half-hearted and a bit late. And even then, they didn't really solve much of the issues. Many of the issues, which is that British manufacturing just wasn't producing nearly as much and nearly anything like the quality of other countries. It's notable that one of the earliest protectionist laws Britain brought in was to have products stamped with the country they were made from. And all that really accomplished was making "made in Germany" a byword for quality.
Yes.
It's quite famous example of that, but that's a bit before Kaiserreich's POD. Essentially, the main thing that makes the British economy worse is not only do they have to compete with American manufacturing, which, at least until the Great Depression properly sets in America with the collapse of Britain, is doing very well and is muscling them out on the world stage. They also have to deal with German manufacturing because there is no real post-war German economic crash to the same extent that there was in real life. There's obviously every country goes through a post-war recession, having been involved in a war, but Germany's is lighter and more easily recovered from than in real life. And then the German golden age starts to dawn, and Britain is desperately trying to keep up on shipbuilding with the naval race, trying to rebuild the Royal Navy. They're still having to maintain the army at the same kind of level they were. The British army numbered 100,000 men on the eve of World War I and a few million by the end of it. It had grown hugely. And without victory in Europe, Britain has a major pacifist movement, to end the war. But she isn't. She doesn't feel comfortable disarming to the same extent she did in real life. So you have all these drains on the state finances, and then there's differences in the political situation. So the failure to win the war causes Lloyd George and the coalition Liberals to basically just crash on the political scene, bottom out. The demise of the Liberal Party comes a little earlier. And that means that a Tory government gets sat in, which is less willing and indeed does not pass many of the important social reforms that took place after the war. So the economy is a little worse. It was difficult for it to get much worse, and indeed it is very slightly worse, I would say. But the key thing is that it's really the political landscape that is a lot worse. Social reform is blocked. The first Labour government under Ramsay MacDonald collapses very, very quickly, and in so doing, is part of that is when the Liberals effectively double-cross them in Parliament and prevent them from passing several things like a housing relief bill and so forth. And then vote against them in MacDonald's vote of no confidence, which happens much the same as it did in real life. He suspends the prosecution of several communist activists, which causes a big old political firestorm about, is he protecting revolutionaries? The answer is no. But that still does cause the collapse of the Labour government, the failure of social reform in post-war Britain. So the answer really is not so much the economy gets worse, such as the cause of violent revolution. The economy gets a little bit worse. The answer really is the British Revolution is a failure of politics, fundamentally.
Okay. Right. Next question. It's from Fugoto935. It's about Spain. So passing it over to you, Droz. Will the car autocrats or national populists?
Well, that's a rather large question because I have to put some context into it. Well, basically, the Carlist movement isn't really unified. It shifted a lot during the years, and it just so happened that in 1936, the official heir to the throne got crushed by a truck in our timeline. Like, just as the Civil War started, he was run over by a truck. And so basically, after that, the Carlist movement just split into 30 pieces.
Coincidence? I think not. Carry on.
Yeah, I mean, the guy was 80 something, so he was bound to die at some point in the 30s. Yeah. But when he died, no one had really a plan about what to do next because the succession laws were really unclear on who was next. Like, they wanted a male king due to Slavic laws, but there was none left from the line. So basically, the succession line came back to the already ruling king, but they didn't like the king, so they wanted a different thing. So basically, a lot of factions began forming. For example, you have the Juanistas, who supported not the king, but his heir, Prince Juan. And on the group that really didn't like the royal line, you had people like the Javieristas, who supported a regency led by, I can't remember if he was a duke or a count. Basically Javier de Borbón Parma, who is currently the Carlist king for some reason. And then another group, which was a bit more authoritarian, like more autocratic, which supported, called the Cruzadistas, supported the, I think he was an Italian dude, but he's basically a Habsburg, Carlos Pio de Habsburgo y Lorena. Basically, that guy almost made it to king in our timeline, but in the end, he didn't do it because Franco and the king didn't really get along, and he signed a letter, and basically Carlos Pio said, well, if they aren't supporting this, then I'm not supporting this. So how does this affect Kaiserreich? Well, that means that if the Carlists get to power, they don't have a single choice. Basically, you have the authoritarian Democrats who support Prince Juan, who wasn't exactly into Orthodox Carlism. He was more like opportunistically using Carlism to justify his own rule. Outside of that usage of Carlism to justify his rule, he passed a lot of decrees and a lot of manifests stating that only a constitutional monarchy could work. So it's really interesting to think how he would react if he managed to rally the Carlists behind, because he wasn't really expecting to get them on a position of power. He was actually just expecting to use them to get to power. So he likely just applies some sections of Carlism to like make them happy, but he will just go back to the role his father had, or to a similar system his father had. Whereas someone like Javier, who is more of an orthodox Carlist, would just go, he would just basically implement every reform the Carlists have ever come up with. Like, they obviously don't bring back the Inquisition because it's dead. But for example, I read very recently that Carlists supported something that was like something called religious unity. That not basically that you eliminate the other religions from the nation, but you discourage their usage and you encourage the usage of Catholicism. So basically, Javier would just try to reduce the rights and the liberties of Muslim groups and Jewish groups in Spain. No, I mean, not outright kicking them out or killing them, but just reducing their rights and their privileges, and try to increase the privileges of the Catholic Church. Whereas someone like Carlos Pio would just say, well, what can I do now? Like, what's next? I'm gonna do 50 things for them, 50 things for the Carlist. All right. He's basically gonna implement whatever he feels like, because Carlist kings, the thing is, Carlist kings can implement whatever they want because they have absolute power granted by the Communion Traditionalista. But they have only a sort of very loose restrictions. Like, for example, the king has to be the protector and the defender of the poor and needy, as according to Carlist doctrine. So basically, they have to have some form of welfare or support for homeless people.
Mm-hmm.
But the rules on how that has to happen. Like, basically, Carlism has a lot of very loose rules, which rarely translates to real policies.
Like a code of conduct for the king, sort of.
Yeah, sort of. Which, in some cases, it can be respected, but it's just too general to really apply. Like, basically, if you twist some of the Carlist morality code in a way, you can create a form of Carlist socialism, which is what happened in the 60s. Obviously, that does happen in KR because a lot after the Civil War and when Carlism was seen as an alternative to whatever Franco was doing. Okay. So basically, to sum up the whole thing I just said, Carlist will be a split between 3 factions, actually 4, but the 4th one is just like a wild card. And there will be authoritarian Democrats for the Juanistas. There will be paternal autocrats for Carlos Pio and the Habsburg line, and national populists for Javier.
Right. Okay. I think that sums it up.
Yeah.
I thought China was complex.
I think we'll do these last 2 questions. Maybe a little bit more brief because we have had some quite extensive questions this time around, and then we'll have, after those 2 questions, we'll have another short break where the viewers can ask their questions. We'll gather them as best we can, and we'll do the audience Q&A afterwards. So this question is from What About This? About East Asia. It's, could you take us through the political structure of German East Asia, and under what pretense is Germany holding the British Southeast Asian possessions? Flame, over to you.
Sure. I'm not sure how many people have seen the China rework teasers we released a couple months ago. Well, like 6 months ago now. I'm not precisely sure when we actually put them. One of those in particular is a letter from the governor of Hong Kong or the governor general, I should say, to the German authority in what is today Vietnam, in Indochina, basically saying we've been abandoned by the sort of British fleet. We need, that promise I was talking about earlier of military force if, somebody attacks us. So please come and help us out. It's really that's essentially the pretense for Germany holding most of these places. It's basically them saying we're going to be kind of the custodian for these places until British rule can be restored. Now, of course, in theory, Canada or Australasia or any of the dominions are really in a state where now, in theory, they could probably send some people to defend these places. But of course, Germany is, not really willing to give them up. and nobody's really in a position to do anything. So there's a legal pretense there of sorts. There's a moral pretense, certainly, but how legitimate that is certainly up to interpretation and the flow of events after 1936. The political structure is kind of a complicated thing, as many colonial structures, because you're dealing with almost a nightmare bureaucracy of different layers of local government. So if you were to look Indochina, say, you're looking at orders coming from the Kaiser's government down to the German East Asian authorities, potentially through the the German colonial office, then going down to a French authority, because the Germans didn't really get rid of the French authorities, because, as I was kind of saying earlier, the French, like the British in some of these places, know where the buttons are. They speak the languages. They've had these structures in place for hundreds of years in some cases.
Yeah.
So it makes sense for the Germans to rule through the French, and the French themselves rule through local native governments in many cases. So in Annam, which today is kind of Vietnam, the French rule through a man named Bao Dai, who was the emperor of Annam. So, you have these orders then coming through him as well. So on from the French to him, then to his local administrators in individual places. So you've got this big chain going on, basically. The thing that holds German East Asia together, though, is really the sort of central figure of practical authority that can kind of get through a certain amount of this bureaucracy. And that's essentially the head of the Navy there. Because in many ways, this is kind of it would be wrong to say that it's a naval colony in any sense. Some people have compared it to Prussia and said it's it's a colony with a navy, or a navy with a colony, I should. It's more that the Navy is the main group that can tell everybody what to do at the German government in Berlin's behest. So it's kind of a complicated matter. There's certainly some things that the Navy couldn't tell individual people to do, but when it comes to matters of defense, which is ultimately what Hearts of Iron 4 is about, because it's a war game, that's mostly the Navy kind of coordinating all these layers of bureaucracy, in some cases cutting through them because they have military force. And yeah, that's kind of how it works.
Okay. Okay, so we'll go on to our last question before we have another short break with audience Q&A. This is from Half Carp or Half Coop, however you want to take that. How elaborate is the African resistance to German Africa? Is it a wide connected network, or are they mostly independent? Over to you, Paul.
It's very dependent. Well, it's sort of dependent. Basically, in Gabon and the Ivory Coast, and you have a lot of connection with the rest of the Francafrique. I'm butchering that horribly because my French is terrible.
It's
the rest of the
sea. It's France-Afrique. Go on.
Thank you, Frenchman. That's legitimate, actually. I'm not being sarcastic. You have a lot of connection with the rest of the resistance in San France. There's a certain syndicalist element to it, but not a huge one. Gabon's the only one that's planned to have a proper Cindy path. At the moment, it has a Cindy path. But for the other places, for instance, with the British colonies, there was never really an attempt to promote that kind of, if you like, cohesiveness or uniformity in administration that there was in France. And so all the former British colonies are quite different. And in a lot of places, it's a lot more based on the resistance of local tribes. So, for instance, the Germans, upon taking over, they promote some tribes, they marginalize others. Really, all colonizing powers did that. So, for instance, in Zambia, what I would point to is that during the British time, one of Zambia's big tribal groupings, which was quite marginalized, considered to essentially be aggressive warrior troublemakers, who really the admin should have nothing much to do with, were the Bemba. Within Zambia, in the Kaiserreich time, the Germans are able to sort of exploit this and bring the Bemba more back into the fold, and this is why when Middle Africa collapses, the Askari, who are local in Zambia, are largely allied with the Bemba chieftains, which is why their head of state is Kenyatta, who is then what they call the Chitimukulu, their sort of high king. Elsewhere in Kikuyu land, for instance, well, they are insane. This bears mentioning. I think the guy who wrote most of the Africa lore once said something to me to the effect of the Kikuyu land is crazy enough that their head of state should really be a spirit goat. That is very much not a kind of Pan-African thing. That's very local, very localized. A lot of the resistance is tribal. In places like Dahomey, for instance, it centralizes around their traditional monarchy, and they have a certain connection to national France as well. But that's mainly an opportunistic one of they can protect us, and we're no longer chafing at the Germans. Elsewhere, you have actually a lot of loyalty as well. So Tanganyika, for instance, is essentially run by the Askari veterans there, whose ultimate vision is to restore order to their sort of segment of Africa and bits around it, and lead it into a sort of more equitable but still allied relationship with Germany. Then there's stuff going on in the Congo, which is a whole mess. But more generally, to answer the actual question, I would say the resistance to Germany and German Africa is not really very widely interconnected, I would say. It localizes very heavily.
Okay. Right. Well, that concludes the second part of the Q&A stream. That's the end of the questions from Reddit. We will take a 5 to 10 minute break now, just to recuperate and also try and take as many questions as we can from the Twitch chat. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions in the chat now. We'll try and answer as many as we can that we feel are relevant and won't simply be just, oh, read this, whatever. So please do that, and we'll be back shortly.
不要那么样的搬起，不要那么样的搬起，面孔贴近，吓坏了人，何必呢？红着脸，跳着心，你的灵魂早已经飘过来又飘过去，再飘飘呀飘个不停，再飘飘呀飘个不停。
这一桩奇异的爱情，像诗歌一样的温馨，像梦儿一样的缥缈，一曲起舞踪影。这一桩奇异的爱情，像月儿一样的光明，像星儿一样的亮闪，甜蜜起舞踪影。我愿诗中的美景，我愿梦里的爱情，我愿心儿的光明，永远不断的长存。这一桩奇 忆的爱情，像月儿一样的光明，像星儿一样的亮闪，天明既无踪影，奇异的爱情，奇异的爱情，这奇异的爱情。我愿诗中的美景，我愿梦里的爱情，我愿心儿点光明，永远不断地长存这桩奇异的爱情，像月儿一样的光明，像星儿一样的亮闪，天明既无踪影，奇异的爱情，奇异的爱情，这奇异的爱情。
不可以。吻在我的心上，让我想念你，总能瞪着你眼睛，你不答应，我也要向你请求，绝不会信，总逼着你嘴唇，你没回应，我也要向你恳求，绝不伤心，给我一个吻。可以不可以？绯闻也没关系，我一样心干净。给我一个吻，敷衍也可以。绯闻表示甜蜜，我一样感谢你。总能瞪着你眼睛，你不答应，我也要向你请求，绝不会信，总能逼着你嘴唇，你没回应，我也要向你恳求，绝不伤心，给我一个吻，可以不可以？绯闻也没关系，我一样心干净。给我一个吻，敷衍也可以。绯闻表示甜蜜，我一样感谢你，一样感谢你，一样感谢你。玫瑰，玫瑰，最娇美，玫瑰，玫瑰，最艳丽，长夏开在枝头上，玫瑰，玫瑰，有爱你，玫瑰，玫瑰，情意重，玫瑰，玫瑰，情意浓，长夏开在荆棘里。玫瑰，玫瑰，有彩云，滴滴是月，滴滴情意，圣洁的光辉照到底。滴滴是月，滴滴情意，圣洁的光辉照到底。玫瑰，玫瑰，知儿心，玫瑰，玫瑰，刺儿泪，今朝风雨来摧残，伤了人间好人。玫瑰，玫瑰，心儿紧，玫瑰，玫瑰，刺儿紧，来日风雨来摧毁，恢复了平平烈烈。
Okay, so welcome back to the final part of today's Kaiserreich Developer Q&A. Today's Q&A is about law, and we're now on the Twitch chat segment where we basically take your questions and answer them as best we can. Because there's so many questions, it will most likely be the answers are short and sweet. So as we're trying to get through as many as we can. So we'll start off straight off the bat. Lord of the Max asks, what kind of changes can we expect to see in a Japanese playthrough in the China rework?
I guess that's a question for me foremost.
Yeah, probably.
Really, we're looking at reworking Japan's foreign relations for the China rework. We're not really going to be changing the internals. We are going to go and do that, but most of the changes will be the way Japan reacts with Fengtian, the way it interacts with the other tags in China, and certainly with the Germans to some degree. I mean, it'll be the same overall relationship with the Germans, which is hostility, but there might be some different opportunities there with exactly how they interact with them.
Okay. Another question from Tarquin, non-stop today. Informing the ROC, how willing would the Federalists and left-wing KMT be willing to work together in the government?
I think this
not
is
very. Basically, the Federalists and the KMT are in pretty bad terms, despite being ideologically fairly close. Both are heavily influenced by socialism, and both are Chinese nationalists. But the question of provincial autonomy is a pretty significant one, and the vast majority of the Federalists are a bit more genuine in their democratic ideology, and they absolutely don't support the political tutelage that part of the KMT does. So it depends on which faction of the KMT is in power, and whether Chen Zhoming is still in what's the word? Still there or not, basically, because he's got personal issues with the KMT, and the KMT doesn't trust him personally.
I'll just quickly add on to that. But like historically, in the 1920s, a lot of the different Chinese factions had a couple of these conferences where they basically all came together and said, how much they'd love to have a negotiated end to all their fighting, and a new government. How much they'd all love to negotiate and work out a diplomatic solution, but of course none of them did. So there was this constant effort to try and do that, but most of the Chinese factions have a very hard time cooperating with one another because they have very fundamentally different ideas about what China should look like.
Yeah, sounds quite similar to the whites in the Russian Civil War in our timeline.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, next question is from Alyaz Bird. Asks, how are small nations in the Austrian Empire handled? Like Slovaks and Slovenes, are they ignored? And in the event of empire falling apart, what do they do?
The Slovenes themselves traditionally had pretty much their autonomy secured, mostly because they had a crown land where they had majority and they controlled the politics in that particular crown land. So they're in a decent shape, but they're not in the same level as the Bohemians and the Galicians at the start. As for the Slovaks, it's a bit rougher. The Hungarians refuse to give them autonomy, and they just refuse to negotiate on that for the most part. Only some very liberal factions are willing to give political concessions of that level to the Slovaks.
Any distinct smaller nations or groups of people within the Austrian Empire that would have a significant, I don't know, not impact, but change or like significance?
Like influence or
an interesting case study. How about
that? The whole of Bohemia. So that has a really interesting dynamic because in consequence of the emperor negotiating with the Czechs, the Germans in Bohemia kind of got sidelined a bit. So that's going to be an interesting part of the rework for Bohemia, is dealing with remaining German influence in the crown land, which is very significant. They're a third of the population, and they control the economy basically.
Okay. On to the next question from Woolly Warrior. What happened to the senior military colleges during the American Civil War? To the faction that used them as training?
I'll take this one. Basically, the senior military colleges in the U.S., being the Virginia Military Institute, West Point, Fort Benning, the War College. Well, I don't remember the full name, but it's in Pennsylvania. They're all open during the interwar. They function pretty similar to how they worked in our timeline. When the Civil War breaks out, a lot of their cadets are taken out of the schools early and put into frontline combat. So, in terms of a civil war, most of the U.S. armies are more effective in combat because they have some people who know what they're doing. But the schools themselves, for the most part, slow down the rate of how fast they can pull out cadets, mainly because they try to teach people as fast as they can to get them out onto the field. But that means they're still working. So New England has West Point on their side, so they can actually put up some really good cadets on the field. BMI is still open, so the US can still put up a lot of people in the field. Fort Benning is still open. The ACTS is still open. The only guys that have an issue with officers is the CSA because they only have the War College, and that one is for very senior members, staff. That's like get to general to brigadier general rather than for strictly frontline roles or logistics. That's not the thing that War College teaches you. That's more like stuff you learn in West Point. So yeah, that's basically it.
Okay.
The Pacific has to open a new school in the I can't remember, in the Presidio of San Francisco, but I'm not really sure how big could it be at the time, because I'm not really sure how big it was when it was in World War II, since it was used as a provisional place to teach.
Okay. Moving on to the second question from Woolly Warrior. Why does General Marshall join the PSA during the American Civil War instead of siding with MacArthur?
Well, first off, Marshall and MacArthur didn't see eye to eye in a lot of issues. During World War II, pre-World War II, and after World War II. And that's something I wanted to exploit a bit. Mainly because Marshall did a lot to try to keep MacArthur in the fight during World War II when the Navy wanted MacArthur removed. And that was even during the interwar period, that they both had to work together. But Marshall doesn't really like MacArthur. He just sees him as an asset. And MacArthur doesn't really like Marshall either. I mean, in fact, in his memoirs, MacArthur kept bashing Marshall as one of those office generals who don't really know what the fight in the front line is. Whereas Marshall just sees in MacArthur a paranoid maniac. And so basically, when the Civil War starts and MacArthur says the government, Marshall just goes, wait, what? and basically, a lot of the army respects Marshall. That has to be clear from the get-go. Marshall is seen as one of the... I mean, he hasn't yet proven that he's a good general, but everyone knows he has some really good potential for leading. So when Marshall just... what's the word? When Marshall just doesn't support MacArthur, a lot of generals just say, wait, if Marshall isn't supporting MacArthur, then we aren't supporting him. So they start looking for a political opposition to MacArthur's takeover, which they found in the Pacific. So they moved to the Pacific with basically a loyalist clique to Marshall to oppose MacArthur. This doesn't mean the majority of the staff goes to Marshall, but this does mean that a good chunk of the best that the US had at the time goes to the PSA.
Okay, cool. On to the next question. It's from Uzik PL. They ask, how much does the things written in after action reports influence Kaiserreich law?
This is an interesting question for me, I guess, because I cannot say that the direct content of them has influenced what I've done, but I mean, an AAR is definitely what pulled me into the into Kaiserreich as a setting, well before I'd actually even played Darkest Hour, certainly, because that's back when I read it, back in I don't know, probably like 2013 or something like that. It was a Republic of China AAR, so the old legacy lore. And as I was reading, I was thinking, wow, this is crazy. Like this, this legacy lore is kind of really weird. But the care and attention to detail that had gone into writing it was really impressive, and so that kind of pulled me into having an interest in this, and eventually pulled me into working on it.
Oh, okay. Nice. That's pretty interesting, actually. The next question is from Dr. Swag44. Asks, what are the internal politics of New England, and what is occurring in it during the Civil War that is not touched upon in event?
Well,
a lot of this. Well, okay, so the internal politics of New England. Your basic primer on them is you read the text contained within the mod Kaiserreich Legacy of the Weltkrieg. Really, the major things going on in them, though, is a lot of what goes on anyway, is a lot of local moving and shaking and power mongering. It's set up with Canadian support, obviously, so there's a lot of Canada getting in touch with like local power structures, if you like, significant families, and essentially grafting in support from anyone they can get their hands on to say, back up this government. A lot of this is touched on by events and focuses, though, but like the stuff that isn't touched on in events is just like the minutiae of, this guy talked to this man in this particular date, and then someone in the Foreign Office made a phone call to this person and said, we'll pay you X to do Y.
Okay, so outside of that, it hasn't really been brushed up on, or it's not really that important to work. Like, it's nothing noteworthy.
It's not that important. A lot of what goes on the day-to-day in countries is not that important. Like, we focus on.
It's a medium. The game is a medium for you to. It needs to bear.
Yes, it's a medium. We focus on like the big significant events, but what we don't show you is the weeks and weeks of talking and power struggles and the debating and obviously the battles as well that all led up to that. They are abstracted to a great degree, so you don't have to manage the relationship between Kennedy Sr. and the Dockers unions in Boston. That is all abstracted for you to an extent. We take care of that almost and don't focus too much on it.
Okay. Next question is from Al Saladino. How strong will the native revolts be in national France? Who wants to answer
that? Pretty strong. It depends what you do, essentially. Like the native revolts in national France are part of the rework. They are a big part of the National France rework that's ongoing, and they're going to, the best I can tell you really is they're going to depend a lot on how you manage things, and how bad they get will also affect the kind of parts you as National France can take.
Okay, so it's not a binary thing.
No, it's not a how strong are they. They are this strong. They have this many men. They use these tags. They revolt in these areas. It really varies depending on what you do, and it depends on a lot of different factors, such that it's impossible to give one succinct answer.
Okay.
Next tip: it's easy to fuck it up.
Oh yeah,
there are really high chances of them being pretty strong.
That is the one constant. Is it's really easy to fuck up.
Okay, next question is from Electric Angel. Does the Union State allow blacks to serve in combat roles?
Well, there is an event in the American Union State where L. Kemp's Long fires a group of protesters after the U.S. wins the Civil War, if you stay with Long. And basically, the event states that there are black veterans among the crowd. So yes, there are black people serving in combat roles. We don't know how many of them, because the game doesn't really make distinctions between people of one ethnicity and the other, between the recruitable population. But yeah, there is black people serving in combat. Okay. Not many, we don't really know how many, but there are.
Okay, next question is from Woolly Warrior again. Why does Virginia remain loyal to MacArthur rather than rebelling with the AAUS during most playthroughs of the American Civil War?
Well, basically because Virginia has a lot of the military staff. Basically, you have the BMI and you have the ACTS who can easily keep control of the province. The only way it actually goes to a different state, or rather, secessionist, no, secessionist, no, rebellious state, is when you assassinate Reed or you compromise with Reed, in which case the ACTS joins the ACTS of the South, and they both together join the AUS, and BMI is just like caught in the middle. So they only really go to the AUS to the ACTS loyalty, seeing or not the legitimacy in the government.
Okay.
Next question is from One Sabi. How or why is Mussolini a socialist? He had already left the movement by the time of the point of divergence and started forming fascism.
Now you say this. Mussolini had left Communist Party. So the Communist Party of Italy, the PCI, is a very different entity from the idea of leftism as a whole. And one of the key things that really shapes the stance of men like Mussolini, and to a certain extent, Gabriele D'Annunzio, whose role is set to change a little bit upcoming. More on that later. The devs will now execute me for leaking. But men like Gabriele D'Annunzio, Mussolini, is that George Sorel is still alive when the revolution kicks off in France. And as the revolution takes on a syndicalist character, well, Sorel was a massive syndicalist. In fact, he's the father of national syndicalism, which men like Mussolini were really big into. As the revolution takes on a syndicalist character, and that then spreads into Italy as syndicalism becomes, if you like, the new orthodoxy on the left, well, national syndicalism, which Mussolini was still promoting very early on, his alliance with Italy's more traditionalist far right, which is represented by, men like Italo Balbo, for instance, who was probably the biggest anti-communist going. That came a bit later. By 1917, 1918, 1919, Mussolini still considered his movement to be a movement of the left. It just was rejecting the notion Marx had of class warfare, believed in a elite elite of effectively educated people, almost, if you like, superior people who then lead the unenlightened masses into revolution. So Mussolini essentially aligns with the left because of national syndicalism.
Okay. On to the next question from Zadi Chan. Since Austria-Hungary doesn't explode, is Magyarization any more effective, and did it have some success already?
The successes of Magyarization kind of stopped in like the 1880s or so. So it was already very much on the decline by 1914. And after the war, it's like the ruling party still supports it and tries to push it, but it's effectively halted by 1936. Like the Hungarians are not able to maintain; they don't have the political power to keep it up, basically.
Magyarization -1 political power per day.
Okay, the next question is from... Oh god, I'm going to struggle with this one. Echard here, Thalion? Will the T. Lawrence path for the Union of Britain be... path for the Union of Britain be maintained, altered, or removed? Yeah, that's it. That's the end of the question. Is that too far to ask?
No, that's fine. I'm willing to talk about it. I don't know if anyone else is willing to let me. But in brief, yes. Probably quite severely. And potentially in such a way that half the community is going to want my head by the time I'm done. So you can guess for yourself what I'm getting at with that, but there will be a similar path available, essentially.
Okay. And I don't know if this is last but not least. I don't know if there's any more questions people are wanting to answer. But how did Transamur come about? That's a question from Kilik.
That's a question I can kind of half answer.
Okay.
Because I didn't, I'm not the primary developer for Transamur, but it does tie into the stuff I do for. Old lore, because it could get changed, was essentially that Transamur was a product of the Kolchak coup, I should say, in Russia. And he sort of fled across Siberia as that failed, and ended up more or less in eastern Siberia in Transamur. And he was in a bad situation, so he called in a deal with the British and the Japanese to essentially ensure that he could remain in some form in control. And so he wasn't really very friendly with Japanese, and he knew that the Japanese kind of wanted that land anyway, and they wouldn't really, give him very much space or much rope. So the deal was basically that the British would ensure that the Japanese stayed at arm's length. But of course, that was in 1924 and 1925. In 1925, the British hegemony breaks, or not even a hegemony anymore. So with the British gone, the relationship kind of just gets frozen. And you end up with a situation where Transamur is not really happy about things. Japan's not 100% happy about things. But they're both kind of stuck with the situation because if either of them makes a move, then they potentially lose everything and Russia comes in and just grabs it. So that's my understanding.
Okay. Now, is there any questions in chat that have not been answered yet that anyone would be quite happy to answer? Because otherwise, I'm quite happy to close this up.
There's a person here that asked about the China update release date. There's not one, unfortunately. As we've said many times in the past, we'll announce when we're ready to announce something. And because this is a mod, because we all have regular lives and things to do, and we're not a professional development team, we're not always going to have a specific date. We don't have a roadmap or anything like that. So it'll be out when it's more or less ready. I think it'll be done by the end of the year, certainly, but we said that 2 years ago. So it'll be out.
Okay. Right. Well, I think, judging by the silence, that
there's a couple that can just really kind of be answered quickly. A couple of Africa ones.
Okay.
Could the Reform Gripper possibly transform Middle Africa into a better place? Yeah. Better is relative. Why is Kikuyu land Natpop? Because they're absolutely fucking insane. Is a Russia rework planned? Yes. We'd be able to annex the treaty ports to KMT, probably. Depends on the KMT to a certain extent, but yes.
Crowd are as confused about the Canadian occupation. Well, they're not happy about it, but there's not much they can do. They're like, how many there are? There are like 50,000 people in thousands and thousands of kilometers of land. So it's not like they're just a blip on the radar.
Yeah. How/why is Oswald Mosley a socialist? Oswald Mosley is a complicated figure and to a certain extent was a political opportunist. Without the rise of Nazism, it's kind of doubtful that he'd move towards fascism as a means to be sort of different from establishment politics. To an extent, he's basically sort of a red fascist in the game. So his political views aren't changed so much as his methods. What happened to Joseph Stalin? He's TBA. But he's not really that relevant.
Right. Well, we have been running this stream now for over 2.5 hours. It's been an absolute pleasure having the Kaiserreich crew here with me. A big thank you to all of them, to Nitram running in the background, Droz, Flame, Paul, Vidya, all been wonderful. But I think for now that's the end of the stream. Don't forget to keep an eye out on Kaiserreich, especially on the Reddit. There's on the Discord for more information as to when the next stream will be on. But as for now, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Do you want to say goodbye, everyone?
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Goodbye. Thanks for watching.